Your thoughts will betray you long before your words do, human. That was the first thing the alien queen said when I stepped into the grand hall of the Seraph Dominion. And the moment her voice echoed across the chamber, I realized every eye in that massive room was already fixed on me. The hall itself was enormous, easily 300 feet across, its vaulted ceiling rising so high it faded into glowing violet mist, where floating crystal orbs drifted like silent moons. Rows of alien nobles lined the circular tiers around the floor, their luminous skin reflecting pale blues, greens, and silver under the light. At the very center stood a single platform of dark glass where I waited alone, the only human within 1,000 miles of this world. My name is Daniel Carter, envoy of the United Earth Coalition, and at that moment I understood something very clearly. No one here believed a human deserved to stand in this room. The air carried a faint metallic chill, and my boots sounded unnaturally loud against the polished surface as the chamber doors sealed behind me with a quiet hiss. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that comes when an entire audience is waiting for someone to fail. Above me, the throne platform slowly descended from the upper tier, guided by columns of soft blue energy. When it settled, the being seated upon it rose with a grace that made the room feel even larger. Queen Seraph was taller than any human by at least a foot, her skin a deep sapphire color that seemed to glow beneath the crystalline lights, her long silver hair flowing like liquid metal down her shoulders. A circlet of living energy hovered just above her brow, flickering gently like distant lightning. But it was her eyes that held the room captive, golden, steady, and impossibly calm. They rested on me the way a scientist might study a rare specimen. One of the nobles whispered something in a language my translator barely caught, the word primitive carrying easily through the chamber. A ripple of quiet amusement passed through the tiers. I kept my hands relaxed at my sides. The queen stepped forward, each movement measured, controlled, almost effortless. "Human Daniel Carter," she said, her voice smooth but powerful enough to reach every corner of the hall without effort. "Your species claims to seek cooperation with the Dominion. Yet humans are known for deception." A few nobles nodded in agreement. She continued, "Fortunately, my kind has no need to rely on words alone." A faint glow spread from her fingertips, pale strands of light curling through the air like drifting threads. My translator whispered a quiet alert in my ear. Telepathic interface detected. The queen tilted her head slightly, as if observing my reaction. "You will not lie to this court," she said calmly. "Because you will not be able to." A murmur moved through the gathered nobles. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a demonstration. I took a slow breath and met her gaze. "Then I suppose," I said quietly, "you'll see exactly what humans are thinking." For the first time, something almost like curiosity flickered in her golden eyes. She stepped down from the throne platform and approached until she stood only a few feet away. The glowing threads from her hand drifted closer, humming softly in the air between us. "Yes," Queen Seraph said. "That is precisely what this court intends to discover." And then she reached out toward my mind. The glowing threads of light drifting from Queen Seraph's hand slowed as they approached my forehead, hovering just inches away like strands of liquid starlight suspended in the air. The entire hall watched with an intensity that made the room feel 10 degrees colder. Hundreds of alien nobles leaned forward from their crystal balconies, their many-colored eyes reflecting the pale glow of the psychic energy. My translator whispered quiet readings in my ear, detecting fluctuations in neural frequencies, but I ignored it. There was nothing to hide anyway. Queen Seraph studied my face for several seconds, as if expecting hesitation, but when none came she extended 2 slender fingers and touched my temple. The contact was gentle, almost weightless, yet the moment it happened the air inside my head shifted in a way that felt impossible to describe. It was not pain. It was not pressure. It was more like a door opening somewhere deep inside my mind. For a brief moment the hall remained silent, and then the queen spoke again, her voice carrying calmly through the chamber. "The human mind," she said slowly, "is louder than expected." A few nobles chuckled quietly, assuming she meant the usual chaos of thoughts every intelligent species carried. But then her golden eyes narrowed slightly as she focused deeper, and the glowing threads around us brightened. "The first thought," she continued aloud, "is not fear. that caused the whispering in the balconies to stop immediately. I could feel the queen moving through my memories the way a librarian might scan the titles of books on a shelf. She was not forcing anything open. She was simply observing what was already there. "You are aware," she said, her tone almost curious now, "that this meeting determines whether your world gains safe passage through Dominion territory." I nodded slightly. "Yes. And yet," she continued, "your dominant concern is not your own safety." The room grew quieter with every word. One of the nobles shifted uneasily. "You are thinking," the queen said slowly, "that you hope Earth survives this meeting." The words echoed through the hall, and then faded into a silence so complete that I could hear the faint hum of the floating crystal lights above us. I kept my gaze steady. "That seems like a reasonable concern." Queen Seralith did not answer immediately. Instead, her eyes drifted slightly to the side, as if she were watching something invisible. The glowing strands connecting her mind to mine pulsed once, brighter than before. "Interesting," she murmured softly. "You are also remembering a city." A faint ripple of curiosity passed through the alien audience. "A human city?" someone asked quietly from the upper tiers. The queen shook her head slowly without looking away from me. "No," she said. "An alien one." That single sentence caused a wave of confusion across the balconies. My mind replayed the memory without effort. A crowded street under a pale orange sky. Foreign buildings shaped like spirals of glass. Smoke drifting upward after a distant explosion of light during an old border conflict years ago. But the queen did not describe the city itself. Instead, she spoke the part that mattered. "The human," she said, her voice softer now, "is carrying a child through the street." A noble interrupted immediately. "A human child?" Queen Seralitha's gaze sharpened. "No." The hall felt even quieter. "The child," she continued slowly, "is of our species." For several seconds after the queen spoke those words, the hall remained perfectly still, as if the air itself had forgotten how to move. Hundreds of alien nobles stared down from their glowing balconies, their expressions shifting from amusement to something far closer to confusion. Queen Seralith did not remove her fingers from my temple. The threads of light connecting our minds shimmered softly, reflecting in her golden eyes as she continued watching the memory unfold. "You were not ordered to be there," she said slowly. "The conflict zone had already been evacuated by your command structure." I exhaled quietly. "That is correct." A low murmur spread across the chamber. The queen tilted her head slightly, focusing deeper. "Yet you returned," she continued, after detecting a distress signal. Her voice carried a subtle note of curiosity now, the kind a scientist might have when encountering something that does not match a theory. The memory sharpened again inside my mind. A narrow street lined with curved alien buildings. The sky above glowing a soft amber color as distant transport ships moved overhead. The queen described it carefully, her voice projecting the scene to every listener in the chamber. "The human moves through unfamiliar streets while the atmosphere alarms are sounding," she said. "The city belongs to a species that your people had recently been in conflict with." A noble near the upper tiers spoke sharply. "Why would a human return to assist an enemy population?" Queen Seralith did not look at the speaker. "That is precisely the question." The glowing threads pulsed again as she watched the moment that followed. "The child appears from beneath a damaged transport vehicle," she continued. "Small, injured, alone." The word injured echoed faintly across the chamber, but the queen's tone remained calm, clinical. "The human stops." Another noble interrupted again. "To capture the child as a bargaining asset?" This time several others nodded in agreement. I could almost hear the assumptions forming in their minds. Queen Seralitha's gaze flickered briefly toward the balconies. "No," she said simply. That single word fell into the chamber like a stone into still water. The queen returned her attention to the memory. "The human lifts the child and carries it through the street, while emergency sirens continue to sound." The nobles watched in silence now. "The human is aware that the child is not of his species," she added. "The physiology is visibly different." One of the advisors near the throne leaned forward. "Then why assist it?" Queen Seralitha's eyes narrowed slightly as she studied the thought forming inside my mind during that moment. "Years ago." "Because," she said quietly, "the human mind categorizes the child under a different label." She paused just long enough that every being in the chamber leaned forward. Then she spoke the word exactly as it appeared in my thoughts. Kid. The translator units around the hall converted the term instantly. A ripple of confusion moved through the alien audience. Explain, one noble demanded. Queen Serelith's voice remained steady. The human species appears to possess a cognitive pattern in which young individuals of any species are instinctively classified under a protective category. She glanced back at me, and for the first time the analytical calm in her expression showed a faint crack of genuine curiosity. In the human mind, she continued slowly, the concept of enemy does not apply to a child. The chamber fell silent again. I shrugged slightly. It seemed like the right thing to do. Queen Serelith studied me for several long seconds, the glowing threads between us shimmering softly. Then she spoke again, this time almost to herself. And yet, she murmured, this is only the beginning of what your mind contains. The silence that followed the Queen's words did not break quickly. It spread through the chamber like a slow ripple across water, touching every balcony, every advisor, every noble seated beneath the glowing crystal lights. Queen Serelith still stood only a few feet away from me, her fingers resting lightly against my temple, while the thin strands of telepathic light drifted between us like threads of pale electricity. Her golden eyes moved slightly as she continued exploring the layers of memory inside my mind, not forcing anything open, simply observing. The alien nobles watched with increasing unease as the moment in the street continued unfolding through the Queen's voice. The human carries the child for several city blocks, she said calmly. The streets are unfamiliar. The language on the signs is not recognized by the human's translator. One of the council members leaned forward from a high crystal seat. Then the human had no guarantee that assistance existed in that direction. Queen Serelith nodded slightly. Correct. Another murmur spread across the hall. The Queen continued describing the memory with precise detail. Despite this uncertainty, the human continues moving toward the nearest medical beacon detected by his equipment. She paused for a moment, her expression growing more thoughtful. The child species belongs to a civilization that had previously rejected diplomatic contact with humanity. The noble who had spoken earlier lifted one of his slender hands. Then the human's action provided no political advantage. None, the Queen replied. A quiet tension settled over the audience. The child is delivered to the entrance of a medical shelter. Queen Serelith continued. Local responders removed the child from the human's arms. Her eyes shifted slightly as she read the next thought forming in my memory. The human does not request compensation. That sentence seemed to confuse several members of the court. One advisor spoke cautiously. Perhaps the human expected recognition later. Queen Serelith's gaze remained steady. The human leaves immediately after ensuring the child is receiving treatment. Another ripple of whispering moved through the hall. I shifted my weight slightly on the glass platform. It was not a complicated decision. The Queen glanced at me briefly, then returned her focus inward. Your species appears to possess a behavioral pattern that does not always align with strategic efficiency, she said quietly. That is a polite way to describe it, I replied. Several nobles exchanged uncertain looks. The glowing threads between us brightened once more as the Queen moved deeper into the memory stream. Then something changed in her expression. The calm analytical focus that had guided her until now flickered slightly. Her eyes widened by the smallest fraction as she encountered another thought hidden just beneath the first memory. She spoke again, but this time her voice carried a hint of surprise. You did not expect the child to remember you. I shook my head faintly. No, the Queen studied that answer carefully. Yet you are thinking about the possibility that one day the child might grow up in a world where humans are no longer considered enemies. That statement drifted across the chamber like a quiet wind. No one spoke this time. The alien nobles simply stared down at the human standing alone beneath their towering throne. Queen Serelith slowly withdrew one of her fingers from my temple, but kept the second in place, as if deciding whether to continue. Her golden eyes examined my face with a level of attention that had not been there when the trial began. Then she said something that caused the tension in the hall to sharpen instantly. However, the Queen murmured softly, that is still not the most unusual thought inside your mind. The words hung in the air long after Queen Serelith spoke them, and the effect on the chamber was immediate. The quiet curiosity that had spread among the alien nobles hardened into sharp attention as every gaze returned to the glowing threads linking the queen's mind to mine. Hundreds of eyes waited for the next revelation, yet the queen herself did not speak right away. Instead, she studied the thoughts moving behind my eyes as though she had reached a section of my mind she had not expected to find. The golden light in her gaze shifted slightly, reflecting the thin psychic strands that still shimmered between us. "You are aware," she said slowly, "that most species construct their thinking around advantage." No one interrupted her now. The nobles simply listened. Survival, territory, influence. Her voice remained calm but thoughtful. These priorities appear consistently across nearly every civilization that has joined the Dominion. She paused briefly before continuing. Yet the human mind does not always follow this pattern. A faint ripple moved through the balconies. Queen Seralith tilted her head as she looked deeper into the thought she had discovered. "When you carried the child to safety," she said quietly, "you did not expect gratitude." I gave a small shrug. Gratitude was not the goal. "Then what was?" asked a tall advisor seated near the throne platform. His voice carried the careful tone of someone studying a new and unfamiliar equation. Queen Seralith answered before I could. The human believed it was simply the correct action. Several nobles shifted uneasily. The concept clearly did not fit easily within their strategic frameworks. The queen continued observing my thoughts as the memory settled into the background, and something newer began to surface in its place. Her eyes narrowed slightly again as the next idea became clear to her. "You are thinking about this meeting," she said. "About this very moment." I nodded once. "Of course." The queen's voice remained steady as she translated the thought aloud. "You understand that this court could deny your species access to Dominion space routes." "Yes." The advisor near the throne leaned forward. "Then the human should be calculating arguments, leverage, diplomatic strategy." Queen Seralith's gaze did not move from my face. "That is not what he is thinking." The room went still again. Even the floating crystal lights seemed quieter somehow. The queen spoke. The thought exactly as it appeared in my mind. "The human is hoping that someone in this room will be willing to listen." A low whisper spread across the balconies. One noble sounded genuinely puzzled. "Listen to what?" Queen Seralith paused for several seconds before answering. The glowing strands between us pulsed softly as she considered the deeper meaning behind the thought she had found. "To the possibility," she said slowly, "that cooperation between our civilizations could exist without either side needing to prove dominance." That statement landed heavily across the chamber. Several nobles exchanged skeptical looks. The advisor spoke again. "That expectation is unrealistic." Queen Seralith did not disagree. Instead, she kept studying my thoughts as if searching for something even deeper beneath them. Then her expression changed again, this time more noticeably. The analytical calm in her eyes shifted towards something closer to surprise. She straightened slightly, the glowing circlet above her brow flickering brighter as her telepathic focus intensified. When she spoke again, her voice was softer than before, but every being in the chamber heard it clearly. "Human Daniel Carter," the queen said slowly, "there is another thought forming in your mind right now." I looked up at her. "There usually is." The queen held my gaze for several long seconds before she revealed what she had just discovered. "You are not wondering whether your people will gain safe passage through Dominion territory." The chamber remained completely silent. Then Queen Seralith spoke the thought that had startled her. "You are wondering whether my people might someday become your friends." For a moment, no one in the grand hall seemed capable of speaking. The question of friendship hung over the chamber like a sudden shift in gravity, subtle but powerful enough to change the balance of every thought in the room. The alien nobles who had entered the court expecting to watch a simple diplomatic interrogation now found themselves staring at something far less predictable. Queen Seralith remained standing only a few feet away from me, the glowing threads of telepathic energy still linking her mind to mine. Yet her posture had changed slightly. The rigid certainty that had defined her presence when the trial began was no longer quite as absolute. She studied my face again, as though the human standing before her had become a far more complex puzzle than she had originally anticipated. "Friendship," one of the nobles repeated quietly from the upper balconies, as if testing the word to see how it sounded in their language. Another advisor spoke next, his tone skeptical. Interstellar relationships are defined by treaties, alliances, and power structures. Friendship is not a measurable diplomatic variable. A few others nodded in agreement. Queen Sarilith did not respond immediately. Instead, she kept examining the thought she had uncovered, following its shape through my mind the same way a scientist might track a new signal through unfamiliar data. The human concept appears to prioritize emotional trust, she said slowly, almost thoughtfully. It is not dependent on strategic advantage. The advisor near the throne platform tilted his head. Then it is inefficient. That statement might have ended the discussion if the Queen had simply accepted it. Instead, she asked a different question. Human Daniel Carter, she said, her golden eyes narrowing slightly as she focused on me again. Why would your species seek friendship with a civilization that has not yet decided whether it trusts you? I considered the question for a moment before answering. Because someone has to start the conversation. The chamber absorbed that sentence in silence. Queen Sarilith continued studying my thoughts as the meaning behind those words expanded through my memory. She saw brief flashes of human cities beneath blue skies, crowded streets where people of different cultures moved side by side, schools where children learned about worlds they had never seen. She saw explorers launching small ships beyond the edges of known space, not because they had conquered every challenge, but because curiosity refused to stay still. The glowing strands between us flickered again as she followed those memories further. Your species believes connection is possible even without certainty, she observed quietly. Most of the time, I said. A faint murmur of discussion began spreading through the alien nobles again. Some of them leaned toward each other, their voices low but urgent. The concept clearly disrupted their usual assumptions about how intelligent civilizations should behave. Queen Sarilith slowly removed her hand from my temple. The telepathic threads dissolved into faint sparks of light that drifted away into the glowing air of the chamber. Yet the silence did not break immediately. The Queen remained still, looking at me as though the last few minutes had forced her to reconsider something far larger than a single diplomatic meeting. Finally, she spoke again, her voice calm, but carrying a subtle weight that had not been there before. Human Daniel Carter, she said. Your mind contains a pattern that is highly unusual among the species we have encountered. I raised an eyebrow slightly. Good unusual or concerning unusual? For the first time since the trial began, the faintest hint of amusement touched the Queen's expression. But before she could answer, a sharp voice echoed from the upper tier of the hall. Your Majesty, one of the senior council members called out. If the human mind spreads these ideas, it could influence the stability of our political structure. The entire chamber turned toward the speaker. Queen Sarilith followed their gaze slowly. Then she said something that caused the room to fall silent once again. Yes, she replied. That possibility has occurred to me as well. The statement from the council member lingered in the vast chamber long after he spoke it, and the tension that followed felt almost tangible in the glowing air of the grand hall. Hundreds of alien nobles shifted slightly in their seats as they considered the implication. Influenced the stability of our political structure. The words had been carefully chosen, yet everyone in the room understood what the advisor truly meant. Ideas could be more dangerous than fleets. Queen Sarilith remained silent for several seconds, her golden eyes resting on the council member who had spoken. The faint circlet of energy above her brow flickered softly, casting pale reflections across the glass floor where I stood. You believe the human mind represents a threat, she said calmly. The council member rose from his elevated seat, tall and dignified in the flowing ceremonial armor of the Dominion's advisory order. His skin shimmered with a deep violet hue beneath the crystal lights. Your Majesty, the human demonstrates a pattern of thinking that does not align with our established frameworks. Such unpredictability introduces variables that our systems were not designed to accommodate. Several nobles nodded in agreement. Queen Sarilith did not challenge him immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze back toward me, as if comparing the concern of her council with the thoughts she had already witnessed inside my mind. Human Daniel Carter, she said slowly. Are you aware that your ideas could disrupt the balance of civilizations that have existed for thousands of years? I considered the question carefully before answering. Ideas tend to do that sometimes. A faint ripple moved through the balconies. The council member spoke again, his voice sharper now. Your Majesty, This is precisely the issue. The human does not even recognize the scale of the disruption his philosophy could create. I folded my arms loosely behind my back and looked up at the towering tiers of alien observers. Actually, I do. That answer drew the attention of the entire chamber again. Queen Seralith tilted her head slightly. Explain. I took a slow breath before speaking, aware that every translator unit in the hall was converting my words for dozens of species at once. Human history is full of moments when a new idea seemed dangerous at first, I said. The idea that nations could cooperate instead of competing. The idea that strangers could become allies. The idea that exploration could connect civilizations that had never spoken before. The chamber listened in complete silence. Most of those ideas were considered unrealistic when they first appeared, I continued. Some people even believed they would destabilize society. The council member folded his hands behind his back. And yet you continued pursuing them. I nodded. Yes. Queen Seralith's eyes narrowed thoughtfully as she examined the reasoning forming in my mind. She could see the memory patterns that supported those words, centuries of human history compressed into a series of quiet lessons about growth, curiosity, and cooperation. After a moment she spoke again, her voice softer but far more deliberate than before. Then you are aware that introducing your philosophy into the Dominion could produce unpredictable outcomes. I met her gaze without hesitation. Every meaningful change begins that way. The council member turned toward the Queen immediately. Your Majesty, this proves the point. The human represents a cognitive anomaly capable of influencing entire populations. The chamber waited for her response. Queen Seralith remained silent for several long seconds as she looked out across the gathered nobles of her empire. Then she said something that caused the entire hall to freeze once again. Yes, the Queen said slowly. But what if that anomaly is precisely what the galaxy needs? The Queen's words did not echo loudly, yet they carried across the grand hall with a weight that silenced every whisper in the chamber. For several long seconds the alien nobles remained completely still, as if none of them had expected to. Hear such a possibility spoken aloud inside the heart of the Dominion's court. The council member who had raised the warning slowly straightened from his seat, his violet skin reflecting the soft glow of the crystal lights above. Your Majesty, he said carefully. With respect, the Dominion has remained stable for more than 3,000 standard years because our systems avoid unpredictable variables. Queen Seralith did not immediately answer him. Instead, she looked across the vast hall, studying the faces of the advisors, diplomats, scholars, and commanders who had gathered to witness the examination of a single human mind. The towering architecture of the chamber seemed even larger now, the glowing pillars stretching nearly 200 feet toward the distant ceiling where faint violet mist drifted slowly through the air. At the center of that enormous space, I remained the only human present, standing quietly on the dark glass platform beneath the Queen's gaze. Stability. Queen Seralith repeated slowly, as though considering the word from a different angle. Is stability always the same as progress? The question moved through the audience like a ripple across water. Some nobles shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward with visible curiosity. The council member answered first. Stability ensures survival, Your Majesty. The Queen nodded slightly. Yes. But survival alone does not explain the expansion of civilizations across the galaxy. She turned her attention briefly toward me again, the golden glow of her eyes thoughtful rather than analytical now. Human Daniel Carter, she said. Your species entered interstellar travel far later than most members of the Dominion. That is correct, I replied. And yet, she continued, humans have expanded their diplomatic networks faster than any emerging civilization recorded in our archives. Several nobles exchanged glances at that statement. It was clearly a statistic they were aware of, but perhaps had not considered in this context. The council member folded his hands together. Rapid expansion does not guarantee long-term stability. True, the Queen said. But it does indicate a powerful motivating factor. Her gaze drifted across the chamber once more. Curiosity. The word lingered in the air. I noticed a few alien scholars nodding slightly. Queen Seralith continued speaking, her voice calm, but increasingly reflective. The human mind we examined moments ago contains repeated patterns of curiosity, empathy, and cooperative problem-solving. These traits appear inefficient when measured against purely strategic frameworks. She paused briefly before adding, yet those same traits may also accelerate cultural development. The council member frowned slightly. Your Majesty, encouraging such thinking could disrupt long-standing alliances within the Dominion. Queen Seralith looked at him again, but this time her expression carried a quiet confidence that had not been present earlier in the trial. Perhaps, she said, or perhaps it could strengthen them. A low wave of discussion moved through the balconies again. I remained silent, letting the Queen speak. After another moment she addressed the chamber as a whole. The human envoy has presented us with an unexpected variable, she said. A species whose primary diplomatic instinct is not dominance, but connection. The hall grew quiet once more. Then Queen Seralith turned slightly toward me and said something that caused every listener to lean forward again. And I believe we have only begun to understand what that truly means. The chamber remained suspended in a strange stillness after Queen Seralith finished speaking, as if the very architecture of the Grand Hall was absorbing the meaning of her words. The towering crystal columns continued to glow softly, casting pale reflections across the polished black floor that stretched nearly 100 feet in every direction from where I stood. Hundreds of alien nobles watched in silence from the circular tiers rising above the central platform, their attention shifting back and forth between the Queen and the single human envoy standing beneath her throne. For a civilization that had perfected diplomacy through logic and structure, the concept that an unplanned idea might influence the future of the Dominion was clearly unsettling. Queen Seralith slowly descended the final step from the throne platform and began walking across the glass floor toward the center of the chamber. Her movements were calm and deliberate, yet every step echoed clearly through the vast hall. When she stopped a few feet from me again, the soft energy of the circlet above her brow flickered faintly, reflecting in her golden eyes. "Human Daniel Carter," she said, her voice steady but thoughtful. "Your species describes connection as a foundation for cooperation." I nodded once. Most of the time. A faint ripple of quiet discussion moved through the balconies again. The Queen continued. "Your mind contains repeated examples of this pattern. You assist individuals outside your own species. You pursue dialogue even when uncertainty remains high. And you maintain the expectation that unfamiliar civilizations might eventually become allies." She paused for a moment, as if weighing the implications of those observations. From a purely strategic perspective, this approach appears inefficient. I allowed a small smile. It can look that way at first. One of the scholars seated high above the hall leaned forward slightly. "Yet the human civilization continues expanding its alliances," the scholar observed quietly. "Yes," Queen Seralith replied. Her attention returned to me again, which raises an interesting possibility. The chamber grew silent once more. "Perhaps the human strategy is not inefficient," she continued slowly. "Perhaps it simply operates on a longer timeline than our models normally consider." Several advisors exchanged uncertain glances at that statement. The council member who had previously warned about instability spoke again from his elevated seat. "Your Majesty, even if that interpretation proves accurate, integrating such philosophy into Dominion culture would require substantial adjustment to our diplomatic frameworks." Queen Seralith inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement. "That is correct." She turned toward the assembled court and let her gaze sweep across the immense audience. "However," she continued, "our history also shows that every significant expansion of the Dominion required adaptation." The hall remained quiet as the meaning of that statement settled across the tiers. Then the Queen looked back at me again, studying my expression with renewed curiosity. "Human Daniel Carter," she said, "there is one final question your mind continues returning to." I raised an eyebrow slightly. "Only one." The faintest hint of amusement touched the Queen's voice. For the moment, she paused briefly before revealing the thought she had discovered. "You are wondering whether this conversation might be the first step towards something larger than a treaty." The nobles watched carefully as she continued. "You believe it could become the beginning of genuine trust between two civilizations that have never truly understood one another." I nodded slowly. "That would be the ideal outcome." The Queen held my gaze for several seconds. Then she turned toward the court and said something that caused the entire Grand Hall to fall completely silent once again. "Then perhaps," Queen Seralith said calmly. It is time for the Dominion to decide whether we are prepared to explore that possibility. For several seconds after Queen Seralith finished speaking, the Grand Hall did not react at all. The silence was not empty. It was heavy with calculation. Hundreds of alien nobles remained seated across the towering circular tiers, their eyes reflecting the soft glow of the floating crystal orbs above. Some leaned toward their neighbors and whispered in quiet tones, while others remained perfectly still, processing the implication of the Queen's final statement. The Dominion had ruled large regions of the galaxy for thousands of years through careful balance, predictable strategy, and calculated diplomacy. Now that balance was being questioned by something far less structured, the possibility of trust. Queen Seralith remained standing at the center of the chamber beside me, her posture calm and composed, yet the subtle glow of the circlet above her brow pulsed slightly brighter than before. She was thinking carefully. The council member who had warned about instability rose slowly from his elevated seat once again. His tall frame cast a long shadow across the glowing steps of the advisory platform. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice controlled but firm, "the Dominion does not make decisions of this magnitude during open court." Several nobles nodded in agreement. Such matters require strategic review, historical comparison, and predictive modeling. Queen Seralith did not interrupt him. Instead, she allowed the statement to finish before responding. "That is true," she said calmly. "But sometimes clarity appears when we least expect it." Her gaze moved across the immense chamber, meeting the eyes of scholars, diplomats, and military observers alike. "A moment ago we examined the thought patterns of a single human envoy," she continued. "What we discovered was not deception, nor manipulation." The Queen paused briefly. "We discovered intention." The word lingered in the air. One of the Dominion scholars leaned forward slightly. "Your Majesty," the scholar said carefully, "intention alone cannot shape the future of civilizations." Queen Seralith nodded once in acknowledgement. "No, but intention can influence the direction of choice." She turned slightly and looked at me again, studying my expression as if confirming the thought she had already seen within my mind. "Human Daniel Carter," she said slowly, "your species believes that trust often begins with small decisions." I gave a small nod. "That has been our experience." The Queen considered that for a moment. Then she turned back toward the court. "The Dominion has always believed that stability protects civilization," she said. "Yet stability alone does not inspire exploration, innovation, or discovery." Several nobles shifted quietly as she spoke. "The human species appears to accept uncertainty in exchange for possibility," she continued. "This philosophy has allowed them to expand their alliances rapidly across multiple sectors of space." The council member folded his arms behind his back. "Or it may lead them into unpredictable conflict." Queen Seralith's golden eyes narrowed slightly as she considered that possibility. "Perhaps," she said, "but refusing to explore new paths carries its own risks." The chamber grew quiet again. The Queen slowly stepped back toward the throne platform, the faint hum of energy echoing beneath her feet. When she reached the base of the steps, she paused and looked across the gathered court one final time. Then she spoke with calm authority. "The Dominion will review the human proposal," she said, "and we will begin with a simple step." The nobles leaned forward again. Queen Seralith turned slightly toward me. "Human Daniel Carter," she said, her voice steady, "you will remain as our guest while the council deliberates." A ripple of surprise moved through the chamber. "Because," the Queen added quietly, "understanding a civilization begins by continuing the conversation." The ripple of surprise that followed the Queen's declaration did not fade quickly. Across the vast tiers of the Grand Hall, nobles turned toward one another in low, urgent discussions. The idea of a human remaining within the heart of the Dominion as a guest was not a minor procedural decision. It was a signal. Queen Seralith stood at the base of the throne platform with the calm certainty of someone who understood exactly how disruptive that signal might become. The soft glow of the circlet above her brow pulsed steadily, casting faint rings of light across the polished floor. I remained where I was, still the only human in a chamber nearly 300 feet wide, and filled with representatives from civilizations that had existed long before Earth launched its first deep space probe. The council member who had warned about instability stepped forward again, though this time his tone was more measured. "Your Majesty," he said, "allowing the human envoy to remain inside the Dominion capital will attract considerable attention throughout our political networks." Queen Seralith inclined her head slightly. "Yes." The council member continued. "Several allied civilizations may interpret this as an early endorsement of human diplomatic integration." The Queen's golden eyes moved slowly across the assembled court. "That possibility has already been considered." The advisor paused, clearly recognizing that. The Queen had anticipated the reaction. For several seconds no one spoke. Then one of the scholars seated along the upper arc of the chamber rose carefully. His voice carried the thoughtful tone of someone more interested in understanding than opposing. "Your Majesty," the scholar said, "if the human remains here during deliberation, it would allow direct observation of human cultural patterns in a non-strategic environment." Queen Seralith nodded slightly. "Exactly." A faint shift in the atmosphere of the hall followed that exchange. Some of the nobles who had previously looked skeptical now appeared more curious than defensive. The scholar continued. "Human civilizations are relatively young compared with most Dominion members, yet their diplomatic network expansion rate is unusually high. Observing the underlying psychology responsible for that pattern could prove valuable." The council member folded his arms, but did not interrupt. Queen Seralith finally stepped up onto the first level of the throne platform, turning so that she faced the entire chamber once again. Her voice carried effortlessly across the immense hall. "The Dominion has always valued knowledge," she said. "We analyze. We observe. We adapt when necessary." She paused briefly before continuing. "Today we encountered a form of thinking that does not conform to our traditional diplomatic models." Her gaze moved briefly toward me again. "A mindset that prioritizes connection over control." The nobles listened quietly. "That difference may represent a threat," she continued, "or it may represent an opportunity." The chamber remained silent as those possibilities settled across the audience. Queen Seralith rested one hand lightly against the arm of the throne. "Therefore," she said calmly, "we will learn more before making our final decision." She looked at me again, studying my expression with the same curiosity that had appeared the moment she first entered my mind. "Human Daniel Carter," she said, "during your time as our guest you will have access to selected members of the Dominion's academic and diplomatic circles." A quiet stir moved through the balconies. "You will answer their questions," she continued, "and you will observe our civilization in return." I nodded slowly. "That sounds fair." The Queen's expression remained composed, yet something thoughtful lingered behind her eyes. Then she said something that caused the hall to fall silent once again. "Because understanding does not begin with agreement," Queen Seralith said. "It begins with curiosity." The quiet discussion that followed the Queen's final statement gradually settled into a thoughtful silence across the Grand Hall. What had begun as a simple examination of a human envoy had slowly transformed into something far more complex. Hundreds of alien nobles remained seated along the towering tiers of the chamber, their attention shifting between Queen Seralith and the lone human standing at the center of the glass platform. The atmosphere was no longer tense in the same way it had been earlier. Instead, it carried the feeling of a question that had not yet been fully answered. Queen Seralith remained seated upon the throne now, her posture relaxed but attentive as she studied the court below. The faint glow of the circlet above her brow pulsed gently, reflecting the slow movement of the crystal lights drifting high above the hall, nearly 200 feet overhead. For several moments she said nothing, allowing the court to absorb what had already been spoken. Then one of the Dominion historians rose from his place along the middle tier. His long robe shimmered with subtle patterns that marked him as a keeper of cultural archives rather than a political advisor. "Your Majesty," he said respectfully, "throughout our recorded history, the Dominion has encountered many emerging civilizations. Most attempted to prove their strength before requesting cooperation." Queen Seralith inclined her head slightly. "Yes, that has been the common pattern." The historian continued. "The human envoy has presented something different. He did not attempt to demonstrate superiority. Instead, he demonstrated perspective." A few nobles nodded quietly. The historian turned his gaze toward me. "Human Daniel Carter," he said thoughtfully, "your species appears to believe that mutual understanding can develop even between civilizations with very different histories." I gave a small nod. "It is not always easy," but it happens. The historian considered that answer carefully before continuing. The Dominion archives record many conflicts that began because two cultures misinterpreted one another's intentions. He paused briefly. Perhaps studying the human method of diplomacy may reduce such misunderstandings in the future. The council member who had previously expressed concern about instability looked thoughtful rather than resistant now. Your Majesty, he said slowly, there may be merit in expanding the scope of this observation period. Queen Seralith rested her hands lightly upon the arms of the throne as she listened to the shifting tone of the court. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried the calm authority of someone guiding a conversation rather than ending it. The purpose of this gathering was to determine whether humanity could be trusted within Dominion space, she said. We have learned that the answer to that question is not as simple as many expected. She paused briefly before continuing. Trust is not established by a single moment. It is built through consistent understanding. Her gaze moved once more across the assembled court. Therefore, the Dominion will not only observe the human envoy, she said. We will begin a broader exchange of knowledge with the human civilization itself. A soft wave of surprise moved through the chamber again. Diplomatic observers will travel to Earth, she continued, and human scholars will be invited to study within Dominion academies. I blinked slightly at that announcement. The Queen noticed and allowed the faintest hint of amusement to touch her expression. Because, Queen Seralith said calmly, if curiosity truly defines your species, then the most effective way to understand humanity is to see that curiosity in action. The chamber remained quiet as the magnitude of that decision slowly settled across the assembled nobles. The grand hall did not erupt into applause or celebration after Queen Seralith's announcement. Instead, the reaction was something far more unusual for a chamber that had governed the Dominion for thousands of years. It was quiet reflection. Across the enormous circular tiers of the court, nobles, scholars, and advisors remained seated beneath the drifting crystal lights, processing the significance of what had just been decided. For centuries, the Dominion had approached new civilizations with caution first and curiosity second. Now, for the first time in recorded history, those priorities had quietly reversed. Queen Seralith remained seated upon the throne, her posture calm as she looked down at the assembled court and then back toward the human standing at the center of the hall. The polished black floor reflected the soft glow of the energy circlet above her brow, creating faint rings of light that spread outward across the chamber like gentle ripples. Human Daniel Carter stood alone on the platform, yet he no longer appeared like an outsider being judged. Instead, he looked like someone who had accidentally opened a door no one had realized was there. One of the younger Dominion diplomats rose slowly from the lower tier. His voice carried the careful tone of someone speaking during a moment that might be recorded in history. Your Majesty, he said respectfully. If this exchange between the Dominion and humanity succeeds, it may alter how emerging civilizations are welcomed into the interstellar community. Queen Seralith inclined her head slightly. Yes, she replied. The diplomat continued. Future civilizations may arrive expecting cooperation rather than competition. The Queen's golden eyes moved across the chamber once more. And perhaps they should, she said calmly. The quiet that followed felt different from the silence earlier in the trial. This silence carried possibility rather than tension. The council member who had first warned about instability slowly stood once more, though his voice now held a thoughtful tone instead of resistance. Your Majesty, he said, history may record that today the Dominion began studying not only a new civilization, but a new way of thinking. Queen Seralith considered that statement for a moment. Then she turned her gaze toward the human envoy one final time. Human Daniel Carter, she said. Earlier today you hoped that someone in this chamber would listen. I gave a small nod. Yes. The Queen allowed a faint smile to appear, subtle but unmistakable. It appears that the galaxy may now be listening. High above the hall, the crystal lights drifted slowly through the violet mist near the ceiling, illuminating a chamber that had just taken its first quiet step towards something unfamiliar. Not conquest, not dominance, something far more difficult to measure. Understanding. And as the court slowly began to adjourn, one thought remained lingering in the vast chamber, unspoken yet shared by everyone who had witnessed the moment. Sometimes the smallest idea could travel farther than any starship ever built.